everyone, and welcome to Depth Insights, where we take a depth psychological look at news and events that are going on in your world. I'm Bonnie Bright, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is an online community for everyone who's interested in depth and Jungian psychologies. And my guest today is Lisa Maroski, who is an author, editor, and playwright. She's a board member of the Monterey Friends of C.G. Jung, and Lisa recently traveled to Colombia with activist and author John Perkins, who writes about mystical aspects of indigenous cultures, including shamanism. And the purpose of that trip was to meet with and to learn from the Kogi Indians, and that's what we're going to be discussing today in great part. I'm really looking forward to hearing about that trip. Thanks for being my guest today, Lisa.
Thank you, Bonnie, for giving me this opportunity to talk about what was really an amazing experience.
Yes, well, this is actually a topic that I've been interested in for quite some time. I have a colleague who has also had the opportunity to travel there, but I've never heard a lot of her stories, unfortunately. And yet, the message that these people have, the Kogi Indians, is really powerful and profound. So we'll get into all of that in just a bit, but maybe we can start out at the beginning, and you can share with us how you ended up going to Colombia and what the draw was for you to travel there.
Yeah, so I saw a movie way back in maybe the late 1990s, early 2000s by Alan Herrera. It's for the BBC. It's called From the Heart of the World, and you can find it on YouTube, actually. And this movie was about his journey into the world of the Kogi. They called him because they saw changes happening to where they live and needed to get a message out to the rest of the world. So that stuck in the back of my head, that movie, and some of the images in it, and some of the things they said about how they trained as shamans and how they lived. They lived very simply. I'll get into that a little more. But it was that movie that really struck me deeply. And then when I found out about the opportunity to go visit Colombia and actually meet real Kogi people with John Perkins and his partner Daniel Cooperman. They lead trips together down there. I just knew I had to do it. So I signed up right away. I had read all of John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman style books, but I hadn't really delved into his shamanism books. So I did that to prepare myself, and there really isn't a lot else one can do to prepare oneself to meet a radically different culture. So I just kind of went with an open mind and an open heart, and whatever I was going to get, I was going to get.
What a fascinating tribe to be able to visit, and I think at this point it might be a really great opportunity for those who aren't as familiar with the Kogi to understand a little bit about their principles and their culture. So can you share a bit about their worldview and their history?
The Kogi are one of 4 tribes that descended from the ancient Tairona culture in, well, what's now Colombia. They live in an area of the world called the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. It's a mountain range that spans really from the northern coast of Colombia through the lowlands all the way up into the snow-covered peaks. So they really live in a microcosm of the world. They have practically every different layer of ecology, from the ocean to, 9,000 feet approximately. And when the Spanish came to South America in the 1500s and basically started conquering, they had already partly retreated up the mountain because the Caribs had come earlier in about 1000 AD. And so when the Spanish arrived in 1500, they were already pretty much retreated up into their own world. And there were a few altercations with the Spanish, but the Spanish never conquered them. So they don't speak Spanish. They still speak their native tongue. And they still live in a very simple way with the earth. And that's what I really was intrigued by, because they have such a profound connection with Mother Earth, whom they call Aluna. And Alan Herrera went back 20 years later. I guess they called him back and basically said, you know, I guess we didn't get our message across well enough. Can you make another movie? And so there's a second movie out that isn't on YouTube. There are a few trailers and interviews on YouTube, but the movie is on, I think, Amazon Prime. It's just called Aluna, and that tells a little more about them and their life and their beliefs. Both movies are really great. I'd highly recommend it. So I think Professor Google says that there are about 20,000 of them. They live in the jungle. They've got small communities, but they don't actually live in the communities. They have huts there that they come together for ceremonies or gatherings of various sorts. And then the families go back out into the jungle, or maybe they've cleared a little land and do some basically subsistence farming. But they live in family units out in the woods.
It sounds like, Lisa, that they have been at least somewhat accessible to people from the media or to certain individuals, let's say maybe, who they feel can actually help them get their message across, this message that is so important to them. And I think I first heard about them maybe many years ago through the work of Wade Davis, who you probably know is an anthropologist who worked for National Geographic for many years. And he had spent some time with them and written about them. And so I'm curious, actually, because you mentioned they're so seemingly secluded up on that mountain where they have gone to such a high altitude and also where they only speak their own language. I'm just wondering at this stage if you could say more about how you perceived their openness, how you were welcomed into the tribe, what kind of access that you had to their actual culture while you were there.
It was very controlled. There is not a lot of access to this day. It's not like, oh, you can go to Taos Pueblo and just kind of show up. You really have to be invited. And the tour the year before, they actually did not go into the community. The Kogi came to them, to the eco lodge that they were staying at. So our group was the first group to actually be invited into the Kogi community. And the first one we went to, we actually camped there overnight. So we slept in tents and were allowed to walk around and look at their, I'll put farming in scare quotes, because a farmer from the U.S. would look at it and go, I don't see a farm, I just see the jungle. And so how they cultivated their crops was in a very naturalistic way. They weren't in rows in earth that had been tilled. They were just planted in and amongst the rest of the jungle.
What a beautiful visual for integration and for working with the natural environment, just as it is.
Yeah, and they know their environment so very well. You know, they study by observing. They're very observant. I could see them observing us, like, okay, these are some white folks. What are they like? We were under the microscope, in a sense, because they need to know how to deal with us, because we're the ones, we meaning basically non-indigenous people who are living, shall we say, unsustainably. We're wrecking things. We're wrecking this planet. And it's showing up in their microcosm. They don't go down into the cities very much. They do. We met one gentleman, for example, who had gone to law school. We were also told that they were part of the inspiration for the peace process in Colombia. You know, we're now, the civil war that had been going on there for 50 years has stopped, and their president got the Nobel Peace Prize for ending that battle.
Well, that brings us actually to a pretty critical point, of course, in our conversation, Lisa, and that is they wanted to get a message out, and that's what the two documentaries that you've mentioned have strived to do. And, of course, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of writing about them, and I've certainly done a lot of reading about them, and I think that a lot of people are familiar with the name of the tribe and maybe what they stand for. But what some of the literature says about them is that they acknowledge explicitly that they're the guardians of the world, and that they have chosen to live in essentially isolation because they want to maintain that devotional culture that is filled with ritual and their history that's so full of meaning for them. But as you mentioned, they actually are being affected no matter how much they seclude themselves. We're all completely interconnected, right? So maybe you can say something about how you perceive their message to be received. So I think certain people are probably more aware of this than others and more receptive to it, but how can you begin to get a message like that across?
Well, their core message is very clear and simple, which is stop plundering the earth. Now, that said, a lot of our way of life entails plundering the earth, not just for oil, but for minerals, even jewels. You know, Colombia has world-famous emerald mines. And by taking those emeralds out of the earth, you're taking away a certain type of energy relationship. So you mentioned their devotion and that they consider themselves the caretakers. Yes, absolutely. And the reason they came out of seclusion was because they realized that they could no longer take care of the earth on their own, that we have thrown it so much out of balance, they need our help. And so they're coming to us really to enlist us as helpers to bring the earth back into balance, to take care of her. Aluna and the way they talk about the earth is as the mother. And we'll get into this a little more, I think, when we get into talking more about depth psychology. But everything in their world, meaning their buildings, the way they're constructed, it's all very earth-based, not just made out of mud, but the way it's oriented to the sun, the way the roofs are constructed, even their weaving looms. They adopted weaving from Westerners, but when they weave, it's not just the act of putting the warp and the weft together and moving the shuttle. It's about weaving the world together. And they look at the loom in terms of the cardinal direction. It represents the whole earth. The men are the weavers, and the women are the ones who spin the yarn. And so the mamos, who are the spiritual leaders, will remind people as they're working what this represents, that they are weaving together the world. The spindle is a very key symbol too, and it gets recapitulated in some of their ceremonies where after you do something, you spin around. And that's to remind yourself of the importance of the spindle and the weaving and how everything weaves together, i.e. connects.
You know, what's occurring to me as I'm listening to you talk about their culture is just how very dramatically different it is from our current culture. And I'm generalizing, of course, but I just have to acknowledge that for the most part that we are not nearly reflective enough. And in fact, we tend to go about with so much speed and so much incapacity to dig more deeply or to allow ourselves to rest in any particular way, in a way that's reflective, such as you're describing with the Kogi. And it occurs to me that they have good reason to require us to meet them halfway at this point and to help them with this whole caretaking aspect of things. because as long as we continue down that track without being able to be reflective, and they are trying to do it all by themselves, it's just never going to work. And this is clearly what's becoming very obvious to them. In fact, I think that our culture seems so childlike in so many ways. It's like, at what point is it that we actually have to grow up and begin to take on the responsibility of what it is that we're actually doing to the planet and even to our own selves by not being able to enter into that more reflective space where we become connected to the earth and the aliveness that's around us and all of those things. So I'm kind of bringing a lot of those threads. I guess that image of weaving is still with me a little bit. It's such a beautiful image. But maybe you can say something further about your experience of how their capacity for reflection and their capacity to actually invite us into a reciprocal experience with them to help take care of not just the planet, but it's literally the soul of the planet and the soul of the culture at large.
Right. Wow, that's a big question. What came to mind while you were asking it, and this might be kind of coming answering it through the back door, is how their mamos, their spiritual leaders, are trained. Because that was one of the things that really grabbed me in that first movie by Aluna Herrera. In the old days, they don't do it this way anymore, but in the old days, the mamos would be able to identify which children might be good to be trained as mamos. And around 9 months, they would begin their training in dark caves. While they were still breastfeeding, the mother would be there to feed them, but essentially they would be deprived of external stimulation, except they would give them enough to prevent blindness. And they would be trained in a cave for quite a long time. And they would be told, what birds were, but they wouldn't have ever seen a bird. When they came out of the cave, the real world was so much more vibrant and alive than they could ever have imagined. What this training also did, I think, was give them an incredible, psychic connection with the earth, that they developed capacities that we don't develop because we are so sight-oriented. We orient first to the external world and then develop an internal beingness, whereas it seemed to me that their system worked in reverse, that they developed the internal world first and then went and developed their relation with the external world. Now, they don't do it. It's not quite that harsh anymore. They start training them at 5 years old now instead of 9 months. So the kids do have a relationship with the external world. But they train till they're 25 or 30. So it's a long training to become one of the spiritual leaders in this community. And we don't put hardly anything like that into training people to be connected with the earth, with each other, with all of life. Some people get to it sometime in their life, maybe later. And in some ways, our culture steers you against doing that. Get out of the dirt. You'll get dirty. No, they don't wear shoes so that they can feel the land, so that they don't lose their connection to the earth. It's a very different orientation. So, remind me of your question again, because I know I was coming at it through the back door.
Well, I think you're addressing it very directly, actually, at least the question that was so strongly in my mind and probably will continue to be strong in my mind, and that is just noticing how very different our cultures are, how very differently we are oriented. And so this idea that for them, this connection to the earth and to the inner world is so front and center for them, whereas we seem to be so externally oriented. And it's no wonder that, of course, they feel at this point that they need to step up the process and help educate us on some level, I think. I'm not sure if that's how they would put it, but to show us how things can be done or how they live, because we do need to take responsibility. We do need to step that up. And it's not, again, just for the benefit of the planet, though I say that with, every bit of weight that carries and should carry, but it's also almost for the benefit of our very survival, of the survival of our souls, I should say, because the way that our culture is going, we just seem to be putting less and less meaning onto this interconnectivity that seems so critically important. And of course, as I hear you describe some of their worldviews and some of their practices, I can't help but think of the movie Avatar, which was such a huge hit in our culture. So there you go. There's something that our culture, that maybe many of us can relate to, that really made a huge splash because it was depicting a world that sounds very much like it could have been inspired by the Kogi, and it perhaps was.
Well, I think we're yearning for it. We're yearning for that kind of a world. So we're making this because we can imagine it, but we aren't there living it yet. I mean, look at who wins at the end of Avatar. The bad guys tear down the world tree. So we have a ways to go.
Yeah, we do have a ways to go. And so from there, I think we have to ask the question, what does it mean for all of us to understand their worldview and how they're living? Because obviously we're not going to take on the same ritual practices that they do. We're not going to live in seclusion up on a mountain and take our kids into training to be spiritual leaders at that age in the same way that they do. We're not going to have some of the same practices that they do. So practically, how do we begin to integrate that? What can we do with the information coming from their message?
Well, let me back up a step and say a little more about Aluna, which is the mother. We can talk in terms of archetype too, but they really, it's literal. Aluna, the mother, is literal for them. They listen to the mother. The mother tells them things. They have ways of using divination to listen to what the mother says. And, I think we have disrupted our relationship to the earth as our mother, as that from whom we derive life, that on whom we are dependent for life, for the food we eat, for the air we breathe. And we treat her as if she were dead. And we long for not a dead mother, but a living mother. And they still have that living mother. They still relate to the earth as primordial female, which is interesting. I know the Mayans, through the work of Martín Prechtel, also have rituals to specifically get the men in touch with their love of the earth as the primordial female, so that they don't go project their ideal onto some human who, of course, doesn't live up to the ideal. To love the earth as the ideal female and let the human females just be who they are without projection. So anyhow, I think this is a grief and longing that we haven't processed as Westerners. And what they would say, too, is that we don't pay her back. She gives and she gives and she gives, and this is part of what their ceremonies are in terms of being the caretakers, making payments back to the mother, back to Earth. And so we went through several of these, they're called pagamento ceremonies. I think pagamento is just Spanish for payment. And they're really a beautiful win-win. And it is something that you can do on your own. You can look at it as magical thinking, or you can really get that it's a win-win for both. So what does it involve? First, think about yourself and what about yourself keeps you separate, keeps you from feeling your oneness with the world. It could be a character flaw, it could be a bad habit, It could be a thought pattern or a state of being. Are you fearful? Are you impatient? What keeps you from being one with everything? And put the energy of that into something biodegradable. So they gave us just a teeny little piece of cotton. You can do it with a leaf. You can do it with a piece of paper. So you put the energy of your fear or your impatience or whatever into this, and then take it somewhere, perhaps to a river, perhaps to the ocean, perhaps just into your backyard and bury it, and give that as a payment to Mother Earth for all that she's done for you. And in giving her the energy of your, say, bad habit, she doesn't look at it as a bad habit. She just says, energy, thank you, and she turns it, she transmutes it back into more life. So it's a win-win. You get to release something, and she gets that energy, and she can transmute it into life, and you have gotten rid of something that is in the way of your connection to her. It's very simple. And every time I do it, I feel lighter. I would invite people to just try it on their own. There was a little more involved in terms of you spin 360 degrees to the left and 360 degrees to the right. And that reminds you of the spindle and the weaving and all of that. It's very holographic, basically. Every single little part is reflected in the whole.
That's so beautiful. I feel so moved to hear you describe that, and I think that what's happening for me is I'm tapping into exactly what you were talking about before, and that is that sense of grief and longing that we haven't processed. And, of course, because I'm familiar with depth psychology, and this is a kind of an underlying tenet of depth psychology, these unconscious kind of longings and soulful ideas that we wish to reconnect with in order to become more whole, in order to live more fulfilling lives. It's amazing to me how much hearing you describe a ritual practice like that can actually affect me. And I can only imagine that others who are listening to this are having that same effect. It speaks so profoundly to the power of ritual and what Jung called the symbolic life. Now, of course, you're a board member for the Monterey Friends of Jung, and so you clearly have a background in Jungian thought and depth psychology. What do you see as the connection here, Lisa? How can you articulate what it is that you experienced in your time with the Kogi that their practice and their culture offers that ties into depth psychological thinking?
I would say access to the unus mundus, to connection, to feeling connected with all of it, to being aware of the consciousness and psyche's presence all around. I think it's a wonderful way to integrate the opposite, as above, so below, the masculine and the feminine, the giving and the receiving. There's always a balance. Coming out of the monotheistic traditions that kind of lost that balance, where it became masculine dominant and focused on sin and repentance, there's this balance in life. It goes this way, it goes that way. It goes this way, it goes that way. And it's our job to know that balance and work ourselves into it instead of working against it. And I think that's one of the things that being with them really helped me see more clearly, is how they dance with that balance.
Yeah, that's really beautifully put. Well, Lisa, there's so much here. Are you doing some writing about this? Is there any intention to write articles or books in order to be able to share your own experiences and integration of this with the wider public?
Not at this moment. I think the writing that needs to be done, as John Perkins was telling us towards the end of the trip, when we were like, what can we do? We're not going to go home and live in mud huts. We have our homes. They eat up electricity. And his thought was basically what needs to happen is we need to leverage the corporation, both in terms of voting with your wallet, but also he brought us this message. John Perkins had spoken at a conference of mostly CEOs, and a lot of them came up to him and said, I know what the right thing to do is, but I'm afraid that it'll cost too much or profits will go down and the board will just oust me and replace me with somebody who just wants the bottom line profits for the company. But if people write to me and say, hey, you need to do more for the environment, you need to change your practices this way, or I am going to take my business elsewhere, then I can take those kinds of letters to the board and say, look, our customers are demanding this. We can't not do this. And so it's changing the corporate culture to go back to being stewards of the earth, stewards of the community. That used to be a directive for corporations until I think it was the early to mid-'70s when Milton Friedman changed the rules and said, nope, corporations just need to maximize the bottom line. That's not the case. Corporations need to be good stewards, and we, the consumers, can use our voices to help make that happen. Because it's not individuals who are going down into the rainforests and cutting them down. It's corporations that are doing it, but corporations are doing it so that they get our business. So if we say we're not going to give them business anymore if you keep cutting down the rainforest, they'll have to listen. So it's a different kind of activism, It's not going out and marching in the streets. It's sitting down and shooting off letters to the corporations that are doing horrible things in the world, polluting. And it's going to become even more important to do this if Scott Pruitt at the EPA gets his way in terms of rolling back all the protections for Mother Earth that we've fought hard to put in place over the last 20, 30, 40 years. So our voices are very important right now. And, go sit in nature, meditate, connect in any way you can, but also send those emails.
Yes, and I completely agree with you. I mean, in fact, we're living right now in a culture that is just rife with so much opportunity. And as much as I feel horrified on a daily basis about what's happening around us and some of the current issues that are being put out by the current administration, I'm also aware that there is a new form of activism that seems to be arising where people are taking power into their own hands. I mean, with social media, they're able to boycott certain corporations. We've started seeing that happening. I saw a campaign where people were asking everybody to unsubscribe from the New York Times because of an op-ed piece that they had published that was not necessarily something that many of the readers agreed with. So there are ways that we can take that into our own hands and be able to make a difference exactly as you're describing. And then also I just want to add to not forget the ritual piece of it. Because this whole process that you described by giving that negative or those blockages that we have, those obstacles that we need to overcome, giving them back to the mother and allowing those to be transmuted, this is not to be taken lightly in any way, shape, or form. It's such a powerful form of magic, as you called it. And I'm just really aware right now, the story that's coming to mind is the story that Jung tells about his visit to the Taos Pueblo, and how when he met with the chief there, Mountain Lake was his name, the chief told him that their religion, their practices, their spiritual practices required that they help the sun, their father, cross the sky every single day through their devotion and their practices. And he believed that by doing that, they were helping not only themselves, but of course the whole world. And he also stated that he felt that if their religion was taken away or that they were no longer allowed or empowered to practice that religion, that the sun would stop rising because it would not have the help from them that was required. And so I just think this ties in so beautifully with everything that you described, and just is such a powerful reminder that we can and need to be involved in whatever way makes the most sense for us, but to also just believe in that power that we have and start using it. start tapping into it. Because I think a lot of us have become kind of numb to that, or we're just not as aware of it, or we're trying to block it out because it's frightening or terrifying on some level, or we just don't know what to do, and so we do nothing. But there are definitely ways that we can engage, and you've brought those out so beautifully in our conversation today.
Yeah, and allow yourself to see the numinosum in everything. Everything has a soul, even things that we wouldn't even consider having souls. My computer, definitely, I know it has a soul. The printer, oh my God, you really have to go around the printer's soul.
Absolutely.
No, seriously,
yeah.
I'm joking, but I'm also not joking, because when you live in a world where everything around you is so alive, you know, like in the jungle, you can't forget that everything is alive, because it is buzzing and it is blooming and it is growing and it's, you know, it's there. We live in lots of dead spaces. The wood that my house is made of has been dead for probably close to 100 years. We forget how alive the world is, particularly if you spend all day in an office, a high-rise office building with artificial carpeting and artificial lighting and all of that dead stuff. It's not really dead. And if we can shift our mindset to getting that, even though we think it's all dead, it's not. There is the numinous in everything around us.
So true, and I'm remembering a story about how Jung used to talk to the pots and pans when he would be in the kitchen. So I think that he would definitely agree. So, well, this has been just absolutely delightful, Lisa. I'm so thrilled to be able to hear some of the stories and to be a witness to the very important message that the Kogi have managed to pass along through you and now through you on to others. So before we go, is there a way that others who might be interested in having a similar experience can actually access that trip, or can you provide more information about how to do that?
Sure. There's another one, pretty much the same as the one I went on, happening this year. It's in December, and the website is ecuadortravelvacations.com. And there's actually a very nice write-up about the Kogi on that website as well.
Great. Very good. Oh, boy, that sounds really like a wonderful opportunity. So hopefully some people can take advantage. And again, even if you can't take advantage of that trip or you can't do it right away, there are just, again, so many things that we can each be doing in order to receive and witness and then act on the message that the Kogi are offering to us. I've been speaking today with Lisa Maroski, who is an author, an editor, and a playwright, and also a board member for the Monterey Friends of C.G. And we've been talking about Lisa's trip to Colombia with John Perkins, where they were able to visit the Kogi Indians. You can also find out more about Lisa on her website, and that's www.lisamaroski.com. That's LisaMaroski.com. Thanks again for spending some time with me today, Lisa.
My pleasure, Bonnie. Thanks for having me.